The first time I saw Shingo do this, I was furious. I was like... Okay, it was a little more like... In Initial D's first stage, we know exactly who the King of Akina is. A prodigy who after much training becomes the master of the Mountain Pass. But people seem to forget a character named Shingo. He drives a compact, seemingly ordinary car, which contrasts against the sports cars that are the fastest in Toge. Still, Shingo impresses everyone, beating several opponents who drive faster sports cars like the S13. He only loses to Takumi in the 8-6 because the prodigy manages to learn a very advanced drift technique in the first corner he ever tried it. What? If you're one of these people, relax because there's a lot more to come. The car Shingo drives is a red Civic EG6, a front-engine, front-wheel drive compact car, which for that reason is not taken very seriously in Toge races. That's because the most common cars on the street are compact FF, front-engine, front-wheel drive. Very different from the sports cars that usually race up and down the mountains, which are FR coupes, front-engine but rear-wheel drive. Sports cars are usually FR for many reasons. For example, better weight distribution, closer to 50% on the front and 50% on the rear, more space under the hood for bigger engines and better components, better handling if you mastered the throttle steering technique, and if you abuse it a little bit, the possibility of drifting, which when you fly it is fun, but can even be faster than the same car racing normally, if you manage to keep it under control, that is. I developed a robot that tries to beat a lap time while drifting. The video is really cool and it's here in the channel if you wanna see how that came along. So it's clear to everyone that sports cars will dominate any type of race. So how can a guy, Shoji Shingo, beat those heavily modified cars? And how can you do the same with your daily driver? All this and more today, here in Racing Legends. Now here's a question. How would you go about defeating your opponents who drive sports cars when you only have a compact car at your disposal? Sounds pretty tough, right? If your name is Shingo though, and you happen to find yourself racing in a Toge race, well, you win by brute force. This guy was able to stand out among the best by using a non-sports car which doesn't have a good weight distribution, which is concentrated over the front axle, and without rear-wheel drive for drifting. The only way he could do that was to turn all these disadvantages into real advantages just by changing the way he drives in the tight mountain roads. The famous Toge. To understand what makes him unique compared to all other Toge races, we need to understand what makes a fast car and driver combination in Toge. And to understand that, we need to understand a Toge downhill. Toge is nothing more than a pass. You know, Toge comes from the Japanese Toge. It's a pass in terms of a winding, narrow road that flows through a mountainside, something quite common in Japan and other mountainous parts of the world. These roads are dangerous though. At any moment, you can lose control and hit a rock wall or worse, fall off the cliff. Also, it's quite winding, just curve after curve, including hairpin turns so sharp that you do a 180. You're going forward and suddenly, frank, you're going the other way. And in this environment, sports cars thrive. The balanced weight distribution allows them to turn more quickly. The power and rear-wheel drive let them drift into hairpin turns as quickly as possible. How, you ask? If the driver's making a turn, their car is stable at that moment. They can only make the turn as fast as the tire grip allows them. But when they go into a drift, the rear starts to go outside. But isn't that bad, you ask? But what about the front? If the rear comes out, the front goes into the curve. Thus, the car is already pointing towards the exit. It already has finished turning before it even finishes the turn. Then, just accelerate and go. In other words, sports cars rule the Toge. So what was you thinking to take a daily driver with none of those attributes to compete on the mountain? Well, to quote someone, because I know someone has spoken those words at some point, a good driver is one who adapts to the most diverse scenarios. If he only has that Civic to drive, he's gonna race that Civic, right? I will do the same. And to match the best sports cars, he had to train a lot, just like Takumi. We can definitely see that because he has fine control of the car even in the most unstable situations. Anyone who's ever pulled a bootleg turn knows that when you pull that handbrake, the car goes wild, out of control and spins around. It's hard to control. Not for Shingo though. He pulls the e-brake, not going straight, but in the middle of a turn, and the car continues smoothly. And I mean real smooth. This is indeed a great display of skill behind the wheel, but the most fascinating thing is why he does it. There are two main reasons he's doing this. First, he may be simply pulling the handbrake hard to lock the rear wheels and simulate a drift, thus pointing the car towards the exit. Or he could be pulling the brake but trying not to lock the rear wheels. The advantage of the first is that an FR sports car needs to wait a moment or two before the car stops drifting and it can accelerate with the car pointing out of the turn. Otherwise, it just keeps drifting and spins. But in an FF car, that doesn't happen, as it's the rear wheels who slide. With the sudden pull of the handbrake, the driver can hit the gas as soon as the car lines up with the corner exit, since the front wheels have grip and pull the car forward and the rear back in place. Okay, it might seem like the second reason doesn't make any sense, as pulling the handbrake without locking the wheels only slows the car down, but that's not true. Cars with a front engine that drives the front wheels have a fatal flaw that plagues them all. You see, when the driver accelerates, you know what? I have a better way to explain this. When the driver accelerates, the wheels follow the powertrain, which moves forward. But the body is on springs, and it ends up lagging behind and leaning more on the rear wheels than on the front ones. That's why the car struggles to find traction and the front wheels skid. This takes away acceleration on the straight line, but the worst thing happens when exiting a turn. When the car understeers and even accelerating with the steering wheel pointing towards the exit of a turn, it goes straight to the guardrail. Actually, I made a video explaining understeer and oversteer in like a minute, so this is the thumbnail if I didn't change it. When Shingo pulls the handbrake without locking the wheels, he's trying to hold the wheels a little so that the chassis leans more forward and puts the weight and thus the traction back on the front wheels. All this to avoid understeer and make the car obey the command to accelerate out of the turn. You know, there's some people who say that all of this is useless, that if you just drive smoothly, everything is gonna be under control. But you're not gonna win any races either, right? Not to mention that rally drivers use the e-brake all the time to successfully perform a hairpin turn, and Shingo's gentle technique can be used in wider corners to help turn the car more effortlessly. Actually, this reminds me that he also used the foot brake before and during turns. Everyone knows that when your car brakes, you're thrown forward. If we pay attention, the same thing happens with the car's chassis. After all, the wheels are the ones braking. Everything on top of them is thrown forward, including the chassis. At this point, you expect the car's weight to go forward and give you more grip at the front wheels. But the problem with doing this during a corner is that the car has a tendency to lose so much grip on the rear wheels that if you brake in that moment, you're doomed. The front grips up and the rear slides out, and nobody wants to see their opponents head on when racing. So you ask, how does Shingo do this if the EG6 never leaves the racing line? And that's where the trick is. He carries the braking into the turn but with progressively less pressure on the pedal, just to point the car out of a turn and accelerate earlier. When your car doesn't have the power, you have to carry the speed you already built up as much as possible. This, in fact, is called trail braking, and is when drivers gradually release the brake while turning the wheel. If the driver manages to brake just enough, they don't lose control and end up turning early and gaining those sweet bends. In other words, Shingo does not brake during a corner. What he does is slowly release the brake going into the turn. Then he waits to only brake again while exiting the turn. Wait. Who brakes exiting a turn? Isn't the logic you brake to slow down before the turn, make the turn without braking, and then accelerate after it as fast as possible? Yes, but the magic lies in the details. This is the final aspect of Shingo's technique. When exiting a corner, a lot of people accelerate hard and end up causing understeer, which is very common in FF cars, and you lose that precious time. In the anime itself, they comment that Shingo's technique is to brake when exiting a curve with his left foot to avoid understeer and thus keep the car on the track. As we've already seen, when the driver brakes, lightly, right, the front tires gain more grip and this reduces understeer. The car follows the line instead of hitting the guardrail and you just gas it and the car surges forward. I would say that this last technique is like using your left foot on the brake to control the accelerator. Because since the two pedals control the same tires, he could simply release the accelerator for an instant and the front would regain traction. I've done this a lot in rally and it works perfectly. Now, the idea shifts when the car is turbo. In that case, this technique actually makes a lot of sense. By keeping your foot on the gas, the turbo remains filled with air and with the pressure high up, which is what gives the car its power. At this point, you left foot brake when exiting a turn just enough to eliminate the understeer, but the moment you release the brake, you have full power right away. On the other hand, if you let go of the throttle, the turbo would lose pressure and you'd have to wait for it to fill up again to get throttle response. And I don't even need to say that when it finally does, the opponent will already be way out ahead. All these techniques that Shingo uses may seem obscure, but we haven't even talked about the two most bizarre techniques he has ever been shown to use, which I swear don't seem to make no sense. If we take a look at this scene, he pulls the handbrake and right away he counter steers. What? I don't know about you, but for me, this is a drift technique. Drift as in a rear wheel drive car. When I try to do this in an FF car, look what happens. In an FF car, I just pull the e-brake, then accelerate without counter steering. And only this way the car turns like I wanted it to. If I counter steer, it just goes back forward or either I lose control. Okay, I imagine this was added just to add some more emotion to the scene in the anime, because after all, there's not much to engage the viewer if the camera only shows the handbrake being pulled and the guy accelerating. But that's okay, whoever makes the anime can make whatever choices they want. But what I can't stand is the guy coming in hard and crashing into other people's cars right before a corner. Tell me he didn't learn to drive in Forza. Alright, I'm not gonna comment on that. It's just not cool to ruin someone else's race in the first corner, and in real life, it's a death hazard. Drive safe guys and watch one of those other videos I talked about. See you in the next video!